Hello, Internet. I hope everybody's New Year's celebration went well. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2023. A year that hopefully will not live in infamy. We've had enough of those lately. Let's go for something really good this year. Anyway, we did our last Christmas exchange yesterday with the kiddos that lived nearby, and it was a good time. I got decorations for my shop from the princess, and those are awesome. And other things that we haven't used yet. We got for ourselves for Christmas, really. Vacuum for the fireplace, Starlink, so that it doesn't take me all day to do videos, and we just got to figure out how to get that mounted and where to route the wire to. But that's all in the windmill up here, getting ground to bits, and hopefully it'll spit out something good. Anyway, let's start off the new year and continue our book. Hope you enjoy. I did a bike ride and posted that today. By the time you see this, yesterday. This internet thing is still getting used to it, I guess. Well, let's turn on the sun and see where we are. In the story, I think the king had just lost and was pissed. Upset. The scarecrow wins the fight. After Billina had entered the palace, Dorothy and Evering sat down to await the success or failure of her mission. And the Nome King occupied his throne and smoked his long pipe for a while in a cheerful and contented mood. Then the bell above the throne, which sounded whenever an enchantment was broken, began to ring, and the king gave a start of annoyance and exclaimed, "Rockety rickets!" Rockety rickets. When the bell rang a second time, the king shouted angrily, "Smudge and blazes!" And at the third ring, he screamed in a fury, "Hippocalarac!" Which must be a dreadful word because we don't know what it means. Yeah, I don't either. See? Hippocalarac? I don't know what that means. After that, the bell went on ringing time after time, but the king was now so violently, my tongue is getting twisted again. Isn't this fun? He is so violently enraged that he could not utter a word, but hopped out of his throne and all around the room in a mad frenzy, so that he reminded Dorothy of a jumping jack. The girl was, for her part, filled with joy at every peal of the bell, for it announced the fact that Billina had transformed one more ornament into a living person. Dorothy was also amazed at Billina's success, for she could not imagine how the yellow hen was able to guess correctly from all the bewildering number of articles clustered in the rooms of the palace. But after she had counted 10 and the bell continued to ring, she knew that not only the royal family of Ev, but OZMA and her followers also were being restored to their natural forms, and she was so delighted that the antics of the angry king only made her laugh merrily. Perhaps the little monarch could not be more furious than he was before, but the girl's laughter nearly drove him frantic, and he roared at her like a savage beast. Then, as he found that all his enchantments were likely to be dispelled and his victims every one set free, he suddenly ran to the little door that opened upon the balcony and gave the shrill whistle that summoned his warriors. At once the army filed out of the gold and silver doors in great numbers and marched up a winding stairs and into the throne room, led by a stern-featured gnome who was their captain. When they had nearly filled the throne room, they formed ranks in the big underground cavern below and then stood still until they were told what to do next. Dorothy had pressed back to one side of the cavern while the warriors entered, and now she stood holding little Prince Irving's hand while the great lion crouched upon one side and the enormous tiger crouched on the other side. "Seize that girl!" shouted the king to his captain, and a group of warriors sprang forward to obey. But both the lion and the tiger snarled so fiercely and bared their strong, sharp teeth so threateningly that the men drew back in alarm. "Don't mind them," cried the Nome King. "They cannot leap beyond the places where they now stand." "But they can bite those who attempt to touch the girl," said the captain. "I'll fix that," answered the king. "I'll enchant them again so that they can't open their jaws." He stepped out of the throne to do this, but just then the sawhorse ran up behind him and gave the monarch a powerful kick with both his wooden hind legs. "Ow! Murder! Treason!" yelled the king, who had been hurled against several of his warriors and was considerably bruised. "Who did that?" "I did," growled the sawhorse viciously. "You let Dorothy alone or I'll kick you again." "We'll see about that," replied the king, and at once he waved his hand toward the sawhorse and muttered a magical word. "Aha!" he continued. "Now let us see you move, you wooden mule." But in spite of the magic, the sawhorse moved, and he moved so quickly toward the king that the fat little man could not get out of his way. Thump! Bang! Came the wooden heels right against his round body, and the king flew into the air and fell upon the head of his captain, who let him drop flat upon the ground. "Well, well," said the king, sitting up and looking surprised. "Why didn't my magic belt work, I wonder?" "The creature is made of wood," replied the captain. "Your magic will not work on wood, you know." "Ah, I'd forgotten that," said the king, getting up and limping to his throne. "Very well, let the girl alone. She can't escape us anyway." The warriors, who had been rather confused by these incidents, now formed their ranks again, and the sawhorse pranced around across the room to Dorothy and took a position beside the hungry tiger. At that moment, the doors that led to the palace flew open, and the people of Ev and the people of Oz were disclosed to view. They paused, astonished at the sight of the warriors and the angry Nome King seated in their midst. "Surrender!" cried the king in a loud voice. "You are my prisoners." "Go long," answered Billina from the scarecrow's shoulder. "You promised me that if I guessed correctly, my friends and I might depart in safety, and you always keep your promises." "I said that you might leave the palace in safety," retorted the king, "and so you may, but you cannot leave my dominions. You are my prisoners, and I will hurl you into my underground dungeons, where the volcanic fires glow and the molten lava flows in every direction, and the air is hotter than blue blazes." "Help, help!" screamed the king. "That will be the end of me, all right," said the scarecrow sorrowfully. "One small blaze, blue or green, is enough to reduce me to an ash heap." "Do you surrender?" demanded the king. Billina whispered something in the scarecrow's ear that made him smile and put his hands in his jacket pockets. No, returned Ozma, boldly answering the king. Then she said to her army, Forward, my brave soldiers, and fight for your ruler and yourselves unto death. Pardon me, most royal Ozma, replied one of her generals, but I find that I and my brother officers also suffer from heart disease, and the slightest excitement might kill us. If we fight, we may get excited. Would it not be for us to avoid this grave danger? Soldiers should not have heart disease, said Ozma. Private soldiers are not, I believe, afflicted that way, declared another general, twirling his mustache thoughtfully. If your royal highness desires, we will order our private to attack yonder warriors. Do so, replied Ozma. Forward, march, cried all the generals with one voice. Forward, march, yelled the colonels. Forward, march, shouted the majors. Forward, march, commanded the captains. And at that the private leveled his spear and dashed furiously upon the foe. The captain of the gnomes was so surprised by this sudden onslaught that he forgot to command his warriors to fight, so that the 10 men in the first row who stood in front of the private spears fell over like so many toy soldiers. The spear could not go through their steel armor, however, so the warriors scrambled to their feet again, and by that time the private had knocked over another row of them. Then the captain brought down his battle axe with such a strong blow that the private's spear was shattered and knocked from his grasp, and he was helpless to fight any longer. The Nome King had left his throne and pressed through his warriors to the front ranks so he could see what was going on. But as he faced Ozma and her friends, the Scarecrow, as if aroused to action by the valor of the private, drew one of Billina's eggs from his right jacket pocket and hurled it straight at the little monarch's head. It struck him squarely in his left eye, where the egg smashed and scattered as eggs will, and covered his face and hair and beard with its sticky contents. Help! Help! Screamed the king, clawing with his fingers at the egg in a struggle to remove it. An egg! An egg! Run for your lives! Shouted the captain of the gnomes in a voice of horror. And how they did run! The warriors fairly tumbled over one another in their efforts to escape the fatal poison of that awful egg, and those who could not rush down the winding stair fell off the balcony into the great cavern beneath, knocking over those who stood below them. Even while the king was still yelling for help, his throne room became emptied of every one of his warriors, and before the monarch had managed to clear the egg away from his left eye, the Scarecrow threw the second egg against his right eye, where it smashed and blinded him entirely. The king was unable to flee because he could not see which way to run, so he stood still and howled and shouted and screamed in abject fear. While this was going on, Billina flew over to Dorothy, and perching herself upon the lion's back, and the hen whispered eagerly to the girl, Get his belt. Get the Nome King's jeweled belt. It unbuckles in the back. Quick, Dorothy, quick! Ah! The Billina, she was hiding under the throne and learned all the secrets, and she's the hero. All righty, that was exciting. Oh, Dorothy obeyed. She ran at once to the Nome King, who was still trying to free his eyes from the egg, and in a twinkling she had unbuckled his splendid jeweled belt and carried it away with her to her place beside the tiger and lion, where, because she did not know what else to do with it, she fastened it around her own slim waist. Just then the chief steward rushed in with a sponge and a bowl of water and began mopping away the broken eggs from his master's face. In a few minutes, and while all the party stood looking on, the king regained use of his eyes, and the first thing he did was to glare wickedly upon the Scarecrow and exclaim, I'll make you suffer for this, you hay-stuffed dummy! Don't you know eggs are poison to gnomes? Really? Said the Scarecrow. They don't seem to agree with you, although I wonder why. They were strictly fresh and above suspicion, said Billina. You ought to be glad to get them. I'll transform you all into scorpions, cried the king angrily, and began waving his arms and muttering magic words. But none of the people became scorpions, so the king stopped and looked at them in surprise. What's wrong? He asked. Why, you are not wearing your magic belt, replied the chief steward, after looking the king over carefully. Where is it? What have you done with it? The Nome King clapped his hand to his waist, and his rock-colored face turned white as chalk. It's gone, he cried helplessly. It's gone, and I'm ruined. Dorothy now stepped forward and said, Royal Ozma, and you, Queen of Ev, I welcome you and your people back to the land of the living. Billina has saved you from your troubles, and now we will leave this dreadful place and return to Ev as soon as possible. While the child spoke, they could all see that she wore the magic belt, and a great cheer went up from all her friends, which was well led by the voices of the Scarecrow and the Private. But the Nome King did not join them. He crept back into his throne like a whipped dog and lay there bitterly bemoaning his defeat. But we have not yet found my faithful follower, the Tin Woodman, said Ozma to Dorothy, and without him I do not wish to go away. Nor I, replied Dorothy quickly. Wasn't he in the palace? He must be there, said Billina, but I had no clue to guide me in guessing the Tin Woodman, so I must have missed him. We will go back into the rooms, said Dorothy. This magic belt, I'm sure, will help us to find our dear old friend. So she re-entered the palace, the doors of which still stood open, and everyone followed her except the Nome King, the King of Ev, and Prince Evering. The mother had taken the little prince in her lap and was fondling and kissing him lovingly, for he was her youngest born. But the others went with Dorothy, and when she came to the middle of the first room, the girl waved her hand as she had seen the king do, and commanded the Tin Woodman, whatever form he might then have, to resume his proper shape. No result followed this attempt, so Dorothy went into another room and repeated it, and so through all the rooms of the palace. Yet the Tin Woodman did not appear to them, nor could they imagine which among the thousands of ornaments was their transformed friend. Sadly, they returned to the throne room, where the king, seeing that they had met with failure, jeered at Dorothy, saying, You do not know how to use my belt, so it is of no use to you. Give it back to me, and I will let you go free, and you and all the people who came with you. As for the royal family of Ev, they are my slaves and shall remain here. I shall keep your belt, said Dorothy. But how can you escape without my consent? Asked the king. Easily enough, answered the girl. All we need to do is walk out the way we came in. Dorothy and Billina argue with the king. Oh, that's all, is it? Sneered the king. Well, where is the passage through which you entered this room? They all looked around, but could not discover the place, for it had long since been closed. Dorothy, however, would not be dismayed. She waved her hand toward the seemingly solid wall of the cavern and said, I command the passage to open. Instantly the order was obeyed. An opening appeared, and the passage lay plainly before them. The king was amazed, and all the others overjoyed. Why, then, if the belt obeys you, were we unable to discover the Tin Woodman? Asked Ozma. I can't imagine, said Dorothy. See here, girl, proposed the king eagerly. Give me the belt, and I will tell you what shape the Tin Woodman was changed into, and then you can easily find him. Dorothy hesitated, but Billina cried out, Don't do it! If the Nome King gets the belt again, he will make every one of us his prisoners, and we will be in his power. Only by keeping the belt, Dorothy, will you ever be able to leave this place in safety." "I think that is true," said the Scarecrow, "but I have another idea, due to my excellent brains. Let Dorothy transform the king into a goose egg, unless he agrees to go into the palace and bring out to us the ornament, which is our friend Nick Chopper, the Tin Woodman." "A goose egg?" echoed the horrified king. "How dreadful!" "How dreadful! Oh, no." "Well, a goose egg you will be unless you go and fetch us the ornament we want," declared Billina with a joyful chuckle. "You can see for yourself that Dorothy is able to use the magic belt all right," added the Scarecrow. The Nome King thought it over and finally consented, for he did not want to be a goose egg. So he went into the palace. He's kind of got that shape already, though, doesn't he? Isn't it? I mean, a little round and or oval. Oh, that was mean. The Nome King thought it over and consented, for he did not want to be a goose egg. So he went into the palace to get the ornament which was transformed of the Tin Woodman, and they all awaited his return with considerable impatience, for they were anxious to leave this underground cavern and see the sunshine once more. But when the Nome King came back, he brought nothing with him except a puzzled and anxious expression upon his face. "He's gone," he said. "The Tin Woodman is nowhere in the palace." "Are you sure?" asked Ozma sternly. "I'm very sure," answered the king, trembling, "for I know just what I transformed him into and exactly where he stood. But he is not there, and please don't change me into a goose egg, because I've done the best I could." They were all silent for a time, and then Dorothy said, "There is no use punishing the Nome King any more, and I'm afraid we'll have to go away without our friend." "If he is not here, we cannot rescue him," agreed the Scarecrow sadly. "Poor Nick, I wonder what has become of him." "And he owed me 6 weeks' back pay," said one of the generals, wiping the tears from his eyes with his gold-laced coat sleeve. Very sorrowfully, they determined to return to the upper world without their former companion, and so Ozma gave the order to begin the march through the passage. The army went first, and then the royal family of Ev, and afterward came Dorothy, Ozma, Billina, the Scarecrow, and Tik-Tok. They left the Nome King scowling at them from his throne, and had no thought of danger until Ozma chanced to look back and saw a large number of the warriors following them in full chase, with their swords and spears and axes raised to strike down the fugitives as soon as they drew near enough. Evidently, the Nome King had made this last attempt to prevent their escaping him, but it did him no good, for when Dorothy saw the danger they were in, she stopped and waved her hand and whispered a command to the magic belt. Instantly, the foremost warriors became eggs, which rolled upon the floor of the cavern in such numbers that those behind could not advance without stepping on them. But when they saw the eggs, all desire to advance departed from the warriors, and they turned and fled madly into the cavern and refused to go back again. Our friends had no farther trouble in reaching the end of the passage, and soon were standing in the outer air upon the gloomy path between the two high mountains. But the way to Ev lay plainly before them, and they fervently hoped that they had seen the last of the Nome King and of his dreadful palace. The cavalcade was led by Ozma, mounted on the Cowardly Lion, and the Queen of Ev, who rode upon the back of the tiger. The children of the Queen walked behind her, hand in hand. Dorothy rode the Sawhorse, while the Scarecrow walked and commanded the army in the absence of the Tin Woodman. Presently the way began to lighten, and more of the sunshine to come in between the two mountains, and before long they heard the thump, thump, thump of the giant's hammer upon the road. How may we pass the monstrous man of iron? Asked the queen, anxious for the safety of her children. But Dorothy solved the problem by a word to the magic belt. The giant paused, with his hammer held motionless in the air, thus allowing the entire party to pass between his cast iron legs in safety. Well, wonder what happened to the Tin Woodman. Oh no, one of their friends is missing. That's horrible. We're going to have to keep reading to find out. My goodness. That's not supposed to end like that. Anyway, I want you all to have a wonderful year and sweet dreams tonight.